All right, let us get started here. Okay, welcome back to SOC 377. Once again, if you missed it last time, because I know not everybody shows up for the first couple days of class, Sociology of Youth. Okay, it seems less full in here, but whatever. All right, so as as I did in the first lecture, and we'll continue to do, we're going to use Slido basically for Q&A. So this is the code. It'll be the same code through the whole semester, basically for the class. So questions will carry over from one lecture to another. Before I jump into talking about the content, now is a good moment to ask if you have any questions about the course that kind of popped into your head from, when was it, Wednesday that I saw you last, till today. Do feel free to pop them up in the Slido, and I will answer them as best I can. Try to do this before we get too deep into the content. And if nothing comes up, I'll jump right in. Okay. Excuse me. Nothing. All right, well, let's jump in then. Okay, so let me go back to my title page. Today, we're going to be talking about the history of kind of childhood and the history of youth. And we're taking one particular account of this that comes from the now deceased, right? He died in 2003. So this book is not new. I believe this book was published in 1979 by Neil Postman, who was a scholar at New York University. He had a doctorate in education, so particularly interested in kind of questions of children. Okay, so, and I mean, if you're also taking critical media studies with me, you'll probably get sick of hearing about Neil Postman at some point, but that's okay. Okay, so Postman, right, excuse me, lifelong New Yorker, and he's most known, I think, for his kind of works on media. And you'll understand why as I start to kind of talk through the argument he makes about where childhood comes from, because for him, it's all about a particular technology, right? And he was really concerned through his whole life's work about how technology was transforming society, right? He wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death about television, and how he thought television was wrecking society. Clearly, he'd never met TikTok. And then other book, this book, The Disappearance of Childhood, which was written before Amusing Ourselves to Death, about why he thought, technology created childhood and ultimately might be the thing that led to its demise as well. And then some other books, Technopoly and Building a Bridge to the 18th Century, both of which I think have held up pretty well, but, they're not for this context. Okay, so what Postman's argument is through this book, and we're going to go, as we do when we talk about, the history of the West, back to the Greeks and the Romans. So you asked, how often do I think about Rome? Far too often, sadly. But to a time where he says, there were no children, at least not in the way that we think of them today, right? And there's kind of particular things that Postman thinks our notion of childhood have, which are a little bit weird. So one of them is essentially delayed entry into all sorts of adult activities, right? So delayed entry particularly into work, right? And childhood as this time of delayed entry into the world of adults, right? So children don't typically work, right? According to our definition, their time is set aside for something else, which is learning, right? Typically, the main occupation of kids from ages like 4 or 5 all the way until, at this point when we're talking 2025, probably somewhere between 22 and 25 is going to be some form of education, right? So that's all of you. You're all here getting some form of education. and your entry into adulthood has been delayed in that way. And then, conceiving, oops, I'm unable to write at the bottom of my slide. Stop it. Okay, innocence, there we go. Innocence, right? So it's a time where children are seen to be, set apart, not told everything about the adult world, and allowed to be innocent, to play, to be sheltered from particular forms of knowledge. Now, what Postman is going to suggest through this entire book, or I guess the first half, we won't read the second half because the second half is a little bit more his speculation of where the end of childhood or the disappearance of childhood is going to come from. It's interesting, and you have the PDFs if you want to read it. Highly recommend it, but we won't touch on it in this class. We're just going to touch on the first 4 chapters, which are basically, his account of where childhood came from. Okay, and all of this he thinks is sort of weird, right? It's sort of a relatively recent historical development, which starts, roughly speaking, between 500 and 600 years ago. So between 500 and 600 years ago, so somewhere around the 15th century, right, the mid-1400s. We'll talk about why in a second. And then, this idea of childhood slowly develops into and youth, right, because we're talking youth in this class, slowly develop over, the subsequent centuries, taking a really long time to unfold into the form that we have them today, right? Okay, so a couple of things that are, I think, interesting about Postman's argument. Childhood for Postman is, inherently a social construct, right? It is something that both did not exist for him in the way that we think about it in the past, and continues to evolve as social characteristics change, right? As economies change, as media environments change, we get different forms of childhood and a kind of unfolding of our vision of childhood over this time. He defines it, pretty broadly, putting childhood somewhere between, between 7 and 17. For the purposes of this class, right, I've sort of said, youth, we're going to say it's about 12 to about 29. So there's significant overlap. And I think some of the reasons that Postman kind of, says, well, at 18 you're an adult, we've seen this sort of stretch out even since Postman wrote the book, so that we're delaying adulthood more and more. And this will, I think, be a consistent theme through the course. We're going to talk about some of those markers of adulthood being more and more delayed as we get later and later into what you might call late modernity. Okay, so let's jump in. Okay, so when we think about childhood, right, Postman wants to take us back to the Greeks, right? And what he notes about the Greeks, right, and you could say this essentially about most other kind of classical agrarian, principally agrarian societies, is that there isn't, for the most part, a notion of childhood in the way we think about it. Oh, good, there was a successful practice lockdown at one of my children's schools. Can't imagine I'll hear about that later. Especially if it's my 5-year-old. I'm sure it's going to be like, oh my God, we have to hide in case someone comes in with a gun. Okay, that should be fun. Hopefully it wasn't him. Okay, what was I saying? Right, so childhood. We go back to kind of classical societies, and we'll see this in the Middle Ages as well. There isn't a concise notion of childhood in the same way as we would see it today, right? They have very different notions of what it means to be young and what it means, and who gets to be kind of young or a youth, right? So there is no kind of proper term for childhood in the way that we think about it. If any of you know, kind of the Western canon and kind of the Bible, right? There's this very famous passage in Paul's letter to the Romans where, he talks about, when I was a child, I thought as a child, I acted as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. And this is one of those things that's actually probably frequently mistranslated from the Greek. And people who really know the Greek will say the more proper term instead of child that Paul is using is infant. right? This is the Greek word pedos, right? Which means infant. And even in Greek, it's a little bit ill-defined what pedos actually means. By the way, this is where the root word in Greek from which we get, such fun words as pediatrician and pedophile, right? From the Greek word pedos, which, essentially translates to infant or child. But again, it's a little bit ill-defined, right? So I think, the Greek translators that I've read, attack chair. All right, I'm going to move that away because I'm a pacer. Never understood, do professors sit down here and sit while they lecture? I've never understood why there's chairs at the front. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The really good Greek translators that I've seen tend to translate Paul as saying, when I was an infant, right? And then I became a man, right? So what do you notice in that kind of disparity, right? There's infant, and then there's man, right? And nothing in between, because the Greeks didn't have this kind of notion. And broadly, you would have stopped being an infant once you were able to do some kind of work. And it was very unequal, for the Greeks. They have this sort of concept of youth, and youth is, according to Postman, a time where citizens should be educated, right? So, if you are a Greek youth, right, you could have been anywhere between maybe 10 years old and probably somewhere in your 30s, and you still would have been a youth. What qualified you as a youth was not that you were a young person, it's that you were studying, right? It was that you were in school, right? And what school looked like was you would go and kind of hang out with a philosopher, someone like Plato or Aristotle or Sophocles, or Plato, Aristotle, or Socrates. Not Sophocles. Sophocles is someone else. Socrates, you would listen to them. They would tell you to go think about stuff. You'd go think about stuff. You'd come back, ask them questions. They would answer them, and you would keep going this way until you were, studied, right? Until you had reached the end of your education, or your family needed you to go back to work because they couldn't afford for you to be a youth anymore. But it's not very specific in terms of, when it ends. There's not an age category for the Greeks. So yeah, it probably starts around 10 and it can end any time where, you either go back to work or you yourself become the philosopher that everybody is studying under. But it's not what we would think of as childhood. Now, very importantly, right, I will say, the For Citizens is doing a lot of work here. Because in the Greek city-states, right, so places like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, there were citizens, and then there was everybody else, which included an absolutely massive slave caste, right? Slaves and non-citizens who didn't have this sort of advantage of being able to be educated, right? They would have been put to work essentially as soon as they were able to do anything, right? So by the time you're 5 or 6 years old, in Greece, if you're in that slave caste, you're probably working and you're no longer, you're not a youth. You're not a pedos either, but you're not a youth. You're just a slave. So it's a very unequal, very stratified. Oh, I guess the other one, in a sense that probably wouldn't have qualified would have been women, right? Because women weren't citizens, and women certainly could not go sit at the feet of a philosopher and study. So, no slaves, no women. Those were, basically property to be disposed of by the citizen class. Okay. Now, according to Postman, what you get in Rome, right? We're in Rome. Hey, so today you can say you thought about the Roman Empire. Good times. So what happens in Rome? According to Postman, I think there's good evidence for this. Again, Latin's a little bit more defined when it comes to childhood. He would have said they had the most defined view of childhood of the kind of European and North African classical societies. There's a very, very particular reason for this, according to Postman. And it's, that Rome was an empire. And Rome was a really big empire, right? Rome went essentially from, the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal are, all the way up to Britain, right? Never quite got into Scotland. The Celts were a bit of a problem for the Roman soldiers, and the supply lines got a little long. Down through parts of Germany, and then around the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, and like the middle, I guess the Levant, right? Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, would have all been included in the Roman Empire. So it's a massive empire for the time. And one thing empires need, especially if they're really big, is communication. So the Romans have a couple of things, according to Postman. They have a relatively high percentage of Roman citizens who are literate, right? So it's maybe somewhere in the range of 10% of Romans could read and write, because you needed a big class of people who could send messages back and forth from Rome across this big empire, right? So that when the Germanic tribes start attacking you in the Rhineland, you can write back to Rome and be like, you know what, we're going to need like 4 more legions up here. So if you could send those post haste, right? And the Romans sent all of these written instructions along those great Roman roads that they had built across the Roman Empire. And if you've never seen like what the process of a Roman legion building roads was, look it up on YouTube. It's a fascinating process. They could build like a kilometer of roads per day with basically no mechanical equipment. It was quite a thing that the Roman legions were able to do. And that's how they spread out, right? And along those roads traveled messengers carrying scrolls made of papyrus with written messages telling, this general and that general what to do, right? What they were supposed to, when they could expect reinforcements, that they needed reinforcements, all flying across the Roman roads. So what do you have when you have a lot of people who can read and write? You have school, right? Or maybe not in the formal sense that you think of it today, right? A building that you would send students to, but you would have had tutors and teachers who came and taught people how to read and how to function and do math and, basic things like geometry. Although I understand doing math with Roman numerals is not the easiest thing to do. So you have schools, which means delay, right? Which means at some point, young people are going to be shielded while they learn how to use written language. So basically, you get that. And according to Postman, a funny thing happens on the way to the forum. Sorry, that's a movie title reference. I'm sorry. The Romans developed this kind of weird sense of shame, right? And basically, they come up with this idea that there's things you shouldn't talk about and shouldn't divulge to children. And these are things like sex, politics, economics, and war, right? Children shouldn't know about this. They need to be sheltered from those things. Now again, the Romans aren't exactly egalitarian about this because again, the Romans have an even bigger slave class than the Greeks did, and they could care less about those slaves, right? And the childhood of those slaves. It's really for Roman citizens. So again, it's not like it's universally dispersed. It's within a very contained class of the Roman citizenry. But you have this kind of notion of, okay, it's okay to tell adults about these things. It's not okay to tell children about it. So you get that sense of innocence. So the Romans have both delay and innocence, right? A period of learning and a period where children aren't supposed to be told things. And there's very, well-documented letters from Roman philosophers like Cicero, basically, I will say telling off other Romans for divulging too many things in front of children. And of course, women who in the Roman mindset, were not much better than children. The Romans weren't nice, especially to slaves and women. Okay, so what happens then? Well, nothing lasts forever. And that's true of at least the western part of the Roman Empire. The thing that you may not know, or maybe you do, is that the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which comes to be called Byzantium, actually lasts until like 1451, right? So technically, and they call themselves Romans. So the Roman Empire keeps going until like well into the 15th century. But the western part of the Roman Empire collapses essentially in 476, right? 476 AD, when these Germanic tribes, they've sacked Rome a couple of times, and finally, one of the kind of leaders of these Germanic tribes shows up in the new Roman capital, a city called Ravenna, which is the Roman capital because it's surrounded by swamps and therefore really, really hard to attack. Basically busts down the doors and tells the last Western Roman emperor, you can pack your bags and go home. I'm in charge here now. And the Roman Empire collapses in the western part, and what you're left with is basically, well, how to put this? Sometimes this is referred to as the Dark Ages, right? You'll sometimes hear, that this period between, and Postman uses the word, although it's kind of interesting because no historian uses it anymore. You get 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, right? Basically between about 476 and around the late 1400s, early 1500s, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, and that's what Postman calls it. Why? Like, what happens? Okay, the Roman Empire collapses, and Europe kind of breaks up into a bunch of small feudal kingdoms, right? They're ruled over by kings and lords and nobility, right? The peasants, end up tied to the land. Most of the big cities that had been built up during the Roman period sort of fall apart. People move out of them back into the countryside where you can do some farming. Very famously, Rome goes from a population at its height of about 1 million people in the Roman period down to somewhere around 50,000. There's a lot of empty buildings and a lot of things that fall into ruin. And all of that communication that was happening falls apart. And what happens is nobody really needs to learn how to read, right? Because the society sort of becomes one that's primarily oral, right? So everything is primarily communicated through the spoken word. And literacy, even though it wasn't particularly high to begin with, essentially disappears. So we go from the imperial model to feudalism. The Roman Catholic Church essentially becomes the central institution of Western European life. And the Roman Catholic Church, for lots of reasons, doesn't really need that many people who know how to read and write. And so you get, knowledge, and especially literacy, becomes the purview of an elite scribal, mostly priestly and monastic, monks class, right? So you get a real collapse of literacy. Very few people can read. And for Postman, what happens is that sort of dissolves that emerging Roman distinction between children and adults, right? Basically, all of that sort of fades away in that 1,000-year period, of the Middle Ages. And you get, a culture that is principally, right, it's oral. So everything's communicated through the spoken word. And that means that basically, by the age of somewhere between 6 and 8, you've acquired all of the language skills that you're going to need to function in the adult world. So, what happens? Childhood gets radically shorter, right? For the most part, children somewhere between the ages of 6 and probably about 8 or 9 are put to work, right, in very concerted ways, often being sent off. Obviously, girls will be tasked with domestic chores and things to do around the house. Male children will be given, often sort of put under the wing of a master where they start learning a trade starting from the age of about 6 to 8, right? So you think you have it bad. You didn't have to learn how to be a blacksmith when you were 6 years old. So, you're doing okay by historical standards. The other thing that happens, right, is what had been, especially in the kind of citizen class or the richer classes of Roman society, a kind of creation of private space, right? So you had larger homes, especially for the rich Romans, country estates where you had, these pretty big homes with multiple rooms, that all really collapses during the Middle Ages. And what you get basically is, for the most part, zero private space, right? No sense of personal or private space. Nobody has their own rooms or anything like that. And it was funny because, it's kind of, this summer I went off to Fort Edmonton Park with two of my kids, right? And in the old fort, they have this basically room, and it's a bunk room where you would have had married couples, kind of in, what was it? There's two bunks, a bed, and then another bed. And then upstairs, there was quarters for their children, right? So the guy said there's like 6 or 7 married couples living in this one room. And then their children, once they're able to climb a ladder, climb upstairs, and they go sleep with all the other children. And this is kind of an interesting thing because it kind of illustrates to me how little private space there would have been, and this is, even relatively late. I think this is in the, the 17th or the 18th and 19th centuries, where the fort was built. Not a lot of privacy though. So what's pretty obvious, right, is that, when those married couples are doing that thing that married couples sometimes do, the one that creates the children that live upstairs, that's essentially all done out in a common space, right? If that sounds really uncomfortable, you thought living in residence was bad, that would be even worse, right? But this was normal in the Middle Ages. Most people lived in essentially one-room huts, right, or one-room cabins on their farm that their family lived in. And so, mom and dad got busy with it, and all the kids essentially knew where all their brothers and sisters had come from, if you catch my drift, right? No sense of personal or private space, or even that was important, that children should be shielded from that. And Postman cites, all sorts of kind of medieval tales and paintings of the, medieval world, where it's described that, adults are grabbing the genitals of children, in living in common spaces with other adults, sharing meals where everybody ate out of a common bowl, which that sounds really gross, especially if you think that there's poor hygiene and everybody's occupation was probably farming. So, that's your shared bowl where everybody just puts their hand in and grabs stuff. Yuck. But also, right, children weren't treated as children. They were, people would have been married, quite young. Think of your Shakespeare, right? When they're talking about Juliet, who was, I think, 12 or 13, and they say girls younger than her are happy mothers made, right? Did you miss that in Romeo and Juliet? It's there. The nurse says it. Right? Girls were getting married very, very young, essentially as soon as, they were of childbearing years. They weren't shielded from it. They all knew what was going on, right? Everything's out in public. People are swearing, using salty language, talking about everything, including sex, in front of children. And essentially, outside of a very small elite, there's essentially no formal education in the medieval period. Now, that's not to say nothing was happening in the medieval period, right? In the Middle Ages, you get the foundation of universities in Western Europe, right? University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, University of Gdansk, lots of other amazing universities owe their existence to the Middle Ages. I can't remember what year Oxford was founded. I want to say it's like sometime in the year like 1064 or something, really, really early. I might have that year wrong, but it's very early. But for most, that's just for the very, very elite of the elite, the priestly class, and a few really wealthy people. Most people get no education at all. Okay, I haven't seen a question slide in a while. Okay, good, there's no questions. Perfect, everything's working. All right, so what changes, right? And where do we start to get this notion of childhood that we have today? So for Postman, it all starts sometime around the year 1440, though we're not 100% sure exactly when this was, because the historical record is a little spotty, where you get the invention of a little technology called the printing press by a guy named Johannes Gutenberg. And again, if you don't know the story of Gutenberg, it's a fascinating story of a guy who's both smart and stupid, as most great inventors are, actually. And I'll tell you very quickly, but again, it's worth looking up. Gutenberg, he's an innovator. He's a goldsmith by trade, and he comes up with this idea because in one of the neighboring cities in Germany where he lives, he hears that there's going to be this religious festival, right? Where people are going to come from all over Europe, basically to buy and sell religious goods. And he knows that there's one thing that people want more than anything, and that's the Bible. Why? Well, up until Gutenberg, every copy of the Bible has to be hand copied. Now, if you've ever held a Bible, there's a lot of words in the Bible, and you can imagine how long it would take to hand copy a Bible, right? A really, 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 really long time, right? And it did. It took years to hand copy a Bible. Plus, the medieval monks had gotten into this habit of creating these illuminated manuscripts. So not only were they, hand copying the Bible, they were illustrating things as well and writing in really fancy script. And Gutenberg's like, to heck with that. I'm going to create a technology that allows me to make a whole bunch of Bibles, and then I'm going to go to this religious fair in Germany, and I'm going to sell all of those Bibles, profit. So what he does is he uses his skills as a goldsmith to basically make a bunch of letter forms out of lead, and then he arranges them and prints one page of the Bible essentially at a time, and makes a whole bunch of copies of the Bible. And then, like the good capitalist he is, he trots off to this other German city where he's heard that there's this religious fair, only to discover that he got the date wrong. It was last year. There's no one there to buy any of his Bibles. And then he's got a problem because in order to, stay alive and make his fancy printing press, right, which he made out of a converted wine press, he needed money. And how do you get money when you don't have any? You borrow it. And what happens when you don't pay back your creditors? Bad things. And that's roughly where we lose track of Gutenberg. We don't really know what happens to him after that. What we do know is his creditors came and repossessed all of his shit. Like you don't pay your car loan, they're going to take your car. In this case, they're like, oh, what do we have here? You spent all this money on this. Well, that's ours now. All right. Now his creditors immediately realize that this is an incredibly valuable invention, right? And they go about building more of them. And then other people hear about them and they copy the technology because really there's no patent laws and the technology is not that hard to copy. And very quickly, there are printing presses everywhere, right? So within about 100 years, there's printing presses in every country in Europe, right? They just spread out. The technology is incredibly powerful, made more powerful by the fact that, Europe at the time was a sort of perfect storm for printing, right? It's a kind of proto-capitalist society, so there's lots of people looking for ways to make money. And how do you make money? Well, you do it by having products that other people want to buy. What do other people want to buy? Well, they want to buy books. And why? Well, you've recently had a sort of rediscovery of classical works. So a lot of the classical works have been sort of lost in Western Europe, meaning there weren't very many copies of them available, right? So think here of the works of Aristotle, Plato, and probably, I'm sure your favorite, but I won't try to write it because I'll get it wrong, Pythagoras, right? Pythagoras, where we get, all that Pythagorean theorem that you have to learn about in math class in junior high and high school, right? Galen and all these kind of Greek and Roman authors, there's copies of them around, but again, they've been hand copied for 1,000 years. They're expensive, there's not very many of them, and people have become aware of them and want them copied so they can read them too. So some copies come out of monasteries, especially in Ireland. The Irish monks have been assiduously kind of copying them for a millennia. Some of them come via the collapsing Byzantine Empire, right? As the Ottoman Turks sack Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine Empire collapses and all of these great works written in Greek come out of Byzantium into the West. And then you have some that are being retranslated from Arabic back into Greek and Latin or English, French, German, and all the languages of the time. But people want to read these things, right? And this is where you start to enter what's called the Renaissance, right? All these works reemerge. Learning kind of reemerges as a more popular art. Why? Because there's more texts available, so more people want to learn how to read. Other things that happen, right? The Europeans, they just happen to be at a very good moment where they have essentially imported technologies like paper making and ink, via the Silk Road from China. And they've got a lot of materials, particularly parchment and other cloth, with which to make paper. You won't get wood pulp for another couple of centuries, but you make it out of essentially cloth. So all this makes things go crazy. Now, according to Postman, this is the moment in which European society, which was basically on par with Muslim civilizations in the Middle East, with China in terms of technologies, kind of on par with other parts of the world. Europe kind of screams ahead, starting in about the 16th century. Okay, now one of the things that happens, right? Printing creates a separation between children and adults, right? Why? Well, because suddenly adults know more stuff than children because they're able to read, right? They're able to read, and reading is one of those things, right? It becomes the basis for adulthood and for being able to function in the economy. Now, again, this doesn't happen all at once. It's going to take a while, right? It doesn't all happen in 1440, but it unfolds over probably about 4 or 5 centuries. But reading starts to become the basis for being an adult. And, outside of a few really exceptional children, most children need to be taught how to read relatively slowly. And what you're going to get, essentially from 1440 on, towards the 20th century is a slow unfolding as, literacy climbs, knowledge climbs, economies get more complex, which requires more reading skills, which requires more time to essentially become more capable and competent in order to, learn how to function in the economy. But one thing's really clear, by the middle point of the Industrial Revolution, probably towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, you're not getting anywhere without being able to read, right? Your economic potential is very, very limited. And so the fact that literacy becomes necessary means that you essentially have to have childhood in the way that we think of it. And again, as a period of delay from the adult world, right? Because you need time to train children in literacy. And along with that delay, you start to get notions of innocence, which kind of come along with it. Okay, I love this nun. I don't know why. Her face makes me happy every time I see it. And I've been teaching this class for 10 years and always use this slide. I think it's because my dad, he's in his 70s now, grew up in the 40s and 50s, or I guess he was like 3 years old in 1950, mostly grew up in the 50s and 60s, and went to a Catholic boarding school, and lovingly tells the story of the nun who ran it, who they lovingly called Sister Paul the Murderer. I'm sure she was lovely. I'm sure there was no reason for getting that name. And I always think this must be what she looked like. I don't know why. So all of the nuns I know are perfectly lovely people. And I know like 10, so, it's all good. What Postman says you need for childhood in the way we think of it is a notion of shame, right? That there is knowledge that children don't have that they shouldn't have, right? And again, you can think about some of those classic, don't talk about it in polite company kind of topics, so sex, politics, war, kind of add religion to that, once you get the wars of religion in Europe. Sex, politics, war, and money, right? It's impolite to talk about money in front of children because children shouldn't have to worry about money, right? They should be shielded from that. And to, tell children about those things or let them experience some of those things for themselves is inherently kind of shameful. I remember an experience that really kind of drives this home for me. Oh man, this must have been back around 11 or 12 years ago now. I had a friend, a guy I knew in high school, he's a really good friend of mine. Let's say his life sort of went a different way. And he had a 5-year-old, his 5-year-old son. And I remember going over like on a Friday night. So his son was 5, same age as my youngest. Okay. And one of his other friends had brought over her son, who was about the same age. And my friend was like, oh, don't worry, Mavericks, he's just off in the other room playing Grand Theft Auto. That's it, right? You got it. Should your 5-year-old play Grand Theft Auto? And why, right? Well, because inherently the content of Grand Theft Auto is not appropriate for children because you have a concept of shame, right? That things like stealing cars, shooting police officers, prostitutes, and whatever else is in that game. I've actually never played Grand Theft Auto, and I don't have any particular motivation to. It's just never appealed to me. Maybe when Grand Theft Auto 6 comes out in 28, 24, 800 years from now, maybe there'll be reason for me to play it. Or maybe it's 2076. I don't know. They keep saying it's going to come out. I don't believe them. So, shame, right? You shouldn't let your kid play Grand Theft Auto because the content isn't appropriate for them. And that's what Postman's talking about. You've inherited this notion that childhood is about innocence and children should be protected from certain things, which is inherently a kind of modern notion that he thinks comes from the printing press. Now, why? Okay, the other condition is literacy, right? So for childhood to exist, you have to have literacy because that creates that space between adulthood and childhood. And where does literacy happen? In schools. And what are schools? They are a form of controlled information release, right? They're a way of controlling information and when it gets out to children. So if you ever wonder, right, and of course we live through this, like I feel like every 4 years in Alberta, where there's arguments over the sex ed curriculum. Why are there such vicious arguments about the sex ed curriculum? Because you're fighting over this notion of childhood and shame. When should you tell kids about sex and how much should you tell them and at what stage, right? This is all built into this, right? We control information through schools, right? We do sex ed through schools. We do all sorts of things through schools as a way of like meting out information about the world, right? In grade 1, you don't start with the Holocaust, thank God, right? So today, children, we're going to talk about the Holocaust. That would go about as well as you think it would. But we think that's inappropriate, right? We're going to talk about the Holocaust, I think in Alberta, never. I don't know. I can't remember what the UCP said should be in the curriculum. I know there's fights about the social studies curriculum all the time. Okay. Oh, 5 minutes left. Where does the time go? All right. So, 3 conditions for childhood: shame, literacy, school, right? All right. So, what Postman says is after 1440, Western society, right? Specifically Western Europe, and then as it spreads out into other parts of the world through colonialism and imperialism, other parts of the world get included in this as well, becomes what he calls the incunabula of childhood, which basically just means cradle, right? Or crib, or bed where, a baby sleeps. Europe and European society really becomes, the birthplace and where our modern notion of childhood is left to mature, right? So what you get with the shift from oral to emerging print culture is new social categories are created. Specifically this notion of childhood and then adolescence teenager, young adult, emerging adult. All of these categories emerge slowly from this transition. Should I tell you this now? I'll tell you this now because it's fun. The word teenage, so adolescence, right? Not the terrible Netflix series or whatever series it was, but the concept. We really don't see until somewhere around between 1850 and 1890, right? Where we're not exactly sure, but it emerges right around this time. The word teenager is not used in English or any language until 1957, right? My dad is 10 years old at that point, right? So this is within living memory. So these concepts roll out really, really slowly. It takes a really, really long time to get from the Middle Ages to here in terms of our notion of youth and childhood, all of which I will describe in painful detail, I'm sure. No, I'm kidding. I'll try to do it as quick as possible. All right, so children become a separate class, right? Why? Well, because they need to be taught how to function in a print culture, right? And there's major economic implications here as well, especially when you get to industrialization in the period after industrialization. And the further on you get from industrialization and the more complex economies become, the more time you need to function in that kind of print and economic system, right? So like if you go back to maybe, 1850, maybe you only needed to be 10 or 12, right? And have maybe 4 or 5 years of schooling in order to function. Today, right, we say that you basically need 13, right? You should have your high school, kindergarten and high school, but probably more like, 15 to 17 years of education. We'll tell you about masters and PhD later. We won't bother you with that. We'll say, a 2-year certificate or an undergraduate education, right? You're looking at 15 to 17 years of schooling. Okay, so what happens? Well, societies start to think of education as an important social goal. So much so, right, that a bunch of Scottish Presbyterian, and thank God for the Scots. They're so much fun and they do so much cool stuff. They call for a national system of education in 1560, right? So basically, public education advocated for in 1560, 120 years after the invention of the printing press. Why? Because they understand that the whole world is moving according to print. Print is such a powerful tool for communicating information and moving information around and building on what other people knew, that reading, they understand, is going to become the basis of a successful economy. I have 1 minute. I can do this in 1 minute, and then we'll start from slide 17. So, where literacy is high, obviously there are schools. Where schools develop, right, you start getting lots of people in school, people start thinking about childhood and children as a separate category of people. And not surprisingly, one of the first places that this happens, and where a lot of our kind of ideas about childhood begin and come from, is from England, right? And there is a proliferation of schools, right? So 1480, 40 years after the invention of the printing press, there were 34 schools in England, right? So that's just that south part of the UK, not the whole British Isles, just England. There were 34 schools. By 1660, right? So only, a couple centuries after the invention of the printing press, there's 444, or 1 every 12 miles, right? Which is not a huge distance. And not surprisingly, the country that ends up being the most economically successful in Europe and the fastest to develop is England. All right, that's enough for today. In that I'm out of time and physically can't keep you any longer. So we'll see you on Monday. We'll start on slide 17, talking about childhood some more. Okay. It is on, everything's on Canvas, yeah. You don't have access to it yet? No. Okay. Once you get access, you should be able to see everything. Yeah, no problem.